Good evening, Dr. Brenner.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for being part of Perspectives.
My pleasure.
Can I just kind of start right at the beginning about playing saxophone before we start talking about leadership?
Sure.
When did you start and how did you get into it?
When I was little, in the States we call it elementary school, and every student was given a plastic recorder, and most of the kids stopped playing the recorder to go off and do other things like athletics, but I continued to play the recorder and enjoy playing the recorder and got pretty good at it. I also, my grandfather at the time was a big classical music fan, and he would give me records, record albums back then, not CDs, of Beethoven and Bach and Mozart and Brahms. And so I was playing the recorder, listening to these great composers, and developed a real love and passion for music. And then as I got a little older, I had the opportunity to learn any instrument, decided to select the clarinet, because I liked the rich, woody sound of the clarinet, and actually got quite good on the clarinet, playing classical repertoire. And then in 7th grade, I was introduced to jazz. Quite by accident, somebody was playing a piece by Miles Davis, and I'd never heard of Miles Davis, and my ear just went, what is that? And that was it. I became, I mean, I still love classical music, but I developed a lifelong love of jazz and wanted to play jazz at school, and there were no clarinets in the jazz band, so I quite naturally transitioned to the saxophone. And I've been playing saxophone ever since. So it's been several decades now, and it's enriched my life tremendously.
So let me move from jazz to leadership. When I went through your material, your website, you are with an instrument.
Yes.
Does that kind of worry people that a musician could actually teach something as serious as leadership?
Probably. But that's okay. That's a decision that I had to make when I was branding my company, Right Chord Leadership. I actually spoke to a mentor of mine and explained to him that I was looking for a way to distinguish myself from other consultants, playing in the same leadership space. And he was the one that suggested, rather than keeping the two worlds apart, those being the world of music and the world of leadership, why not combine them? Two interests of mine, two passions of mine, which I had quite deliberately been keeping apart for the very same reason that you mentioned, for fear that some would find the musical aspect frivolous or perhaps superfluous. But once he led me to that insight, I realized that the world of music and the world of business actually have quite a lot in common, and that my years and years of experience as a musician could bring actually a very fresh perspective to leadership. So that's...
Give me an insight.
How it came about.
Because you're talking to the converted here. I love music myself, and I can certainly see the parallels. But take me through a few parallels you see, because it probably doesn't come as conventional wisdom, isn't it? Music and business, music is much more fluid, it's more collaborative. Business is a bit more ruthless. You're expected to kind of know everything and play according to a plan and
Sure.
da-di-da-di-da.
And that's the exact leadership paradigm that I'm trying to encourage my clients to get away from. The command and control, if you will, leadership structure that emerged from the industrial age, at least in the United States, and continued through the 50s and 60s, where you showed up, you clocked in, you were expected to take directions from your boss, not color outside the lines, do as you were told, not make waves, clock out at the end of the day and come back the next day and do it all over again. That I think is no longer a sufficient model for the complexity of the 21st century. And one of the things that interests me and was part of my studies is looking at alternative models of organizational models. So we look to nature, for example, which is a fascinating source of new paradigms and new metaphors. And music as well, particularly jazz, which is the type of music that I'm involved with. If you think about a jazz quartet, say, what a very common structure in jazz is to play what's called a head, which is the opening melody, and then each instrumentalist goes off and takes a solo. It doesn't
Improvises on it.
Improvises on it. It doesn't fall apart. It doesn't. Well, sometimes I guess it does, but most of the time, if
the players are not good, right?
that's right. But assuming that they're good players, the song maintains its structure. It maintains its cohesion, and yet you have multiple players playing literally whatever's coming off the top of their head. And that was a dynamic that really fascinated me, and it's a metaphor that I like using in business. If you think of a jazz solo, the soloists are playing within a set of chords, and usually the pianist or the guitar is playing the chords. So it's not just a wild free-for-all. There is some structure, but within the structure of the chords, there's almost unlimited freedom. Sure. And for me, that resonated for me as a metaphor for organizations and for leadership. There has to be some rules, there has to be some structure, but within that to explore and allow your people the autonomy to do what they do, express themselves, without being micromanaged, without having every move delineated. Those, in terms of what I've read, those are the organizations where amazing things happen. They're really at the vanguard of the creative and innovative movements that are happening now. You think of, Apple, or you think of some of these other technology companies, that Google, of course. They are redefining organizational structure and leadership using models and paradigms that traditionally have never been part of the conversation.
Cantaloupe Island.
Yes, Herbie Hancock.
Is something that came to mind when you were talking about the unlimited amount of freedom that is there still within a certain structure. Now that's been done so many times in so many different ways.
Sure.
But still, the moment you hear the first set of chords, you know that's Cantaloupe Island.
That's right. That's right. That's a very identifiable.
And all of a sudden, you'll hear something completely different, including someone like Snoop Dogg that raps to it.
Yes, exactly.
And still, it's still Cantaloupe Island.
That's right.
Now, how do you convince people that that's possible in business?
Well, the people I work with obviously have to be open and receptive to the idea of bridging the worlds of music and business in the first place. And I can get a sense very early on if that's going to be an issue or not. And I'll be very honest with them and upfront, and I'll say I have a somewhat unconventional style, unconventional approach that may or may not be your cup of tea. I also want to say, however, that the musical piece is like sort of seasoning. It's not the main dish. Because what I learned is I need to calibrate the musical piece in such a way that it's palatable for the client. In other words, I don't want to hit them with music. Let's face it, not everybody loves music as much as I do, and I don't want to have them be disengaged. I think most people like music, not everybody loves music. So I'm careful in how I calibrate how much I use the music. So when I do my programs on emotional intelligence or interpersonal communication skills or conflict management or how to become an influential leader or any number of programs I do, there may be some seasoning of music. I may bring in some jazz metaphors. I may bring in some exercises where I'll have the saxophone, or I may not. It really depends on how I feel out what will be best for that client and that particular program.
What's the biggest leadership challenge for business?
In my experience?
Yes.
I think the biggest leadership challenge is the idea that companies now are so, at least the ones I work with, are fairly mid to large, and it's no longer the case that a singular leader can hope to manage the complexity dare I say, the chaos of the modern organization. Maybe back in the day they were able to, because maybe the companies were a little smaller or
less complicated.
Less complicated. You have the emergence of technology, which has changed the face of business forever. You have globalization. You have all kinds of complexities and intricacies and challenges that you simply didn't have 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And so what's interesting, I find, for leaders is that they need to, it's almost an oxymoron or a paradox. In order for leaders to become more powerful, they actually have to give up some of their leadership. And it's sort of counterintuitive, and some folks I work with back in the States struggle with that conception. But truly, I think that for me to make the case that vulnerability in a leader is okay. You don't necessarily have all the answers. And that's okay to admit that you don't have all the answers. It's okay to delegate. It's okay to solicit opinions from a wide array of people. You don't have to be that singular voice of leadership that you learned about in business school. And I think for what I've seen, that's an ongoing challenge. I'm starting to see some shifting, I think, for the better. But obviously not every leader is on board with that. We certainly still have the very conventional, sort of traditional leader who sort of pulls all the strings from his or her corner office on the top floor, and that will probably be with us for a long, long time. But with the younger generation coming up and starting to question the way things have been done from a leadership perspective, introducing new metaphors, new models, new paradigms, we're starting to see some very interesting and highly innovative new forms of leadership. So that's one that comes to mind.
I'm going to throw a question at you which I generally get questioned on. Can you teach leadership?
That's a great question. One of the things that I let people know at the beginning of my programs is I can't train them to be good leaders. And I make the distinction between training and learning or developing or strengthening skills. I think what I do, or the way I think about my job when I'm working with a client, is strengthening the skills and the competencies and the abilities that clearly already exist in the individual, or they wouldn't be sitting there, right? But for me to say I can train you to be a good leader makes it sound like they're taking a PowerPoint program. Where they're coming in the morning, they don't know how to use Excel, or they don't know how to use PowerPoint, or they don't know how to use Word, and by the end of the day, they're fluent in it. Leadership doesn't work that way.
But a lot of people do expect it of you, don't they?
Well, that's up to me and my fellow consultants to educate our clientele, and I don't know how good of a job we've done historically in that area. It's funny, Vidusha, I have a lot of clients who say to me, Mike, we want you to come in and do a conflict management program for this particular team. They're having all kinds of dysfunction and all kinds of issues, and can you do it in an hour? So I say, look, I can do it in an hour, of course, but you need to understand that we'll only get this deep. So, this is a lifelong journey of development. One must be disciplined and committed to self-development, and not everybody is. So what I always tell people is you're going to get out of the program what you're willing to put into it. And I think that's really, largely the case.
The combination between learning facilitation or training or that kind of intervention and coaching. Yeah. There's a lot of focus today on coaching and mentoring and having a mix of the two. What's your experience been with coaching? Does that do any better for leadership development than a traditional training program per se?
I don't look at it necessarily as in competition. I look at them as working in harmony. And I am an advocate of coaching. In fact, one of my programs is all about coaching. I try to instill in my clients the importance of coaching for creating a culture of trust, a culture where people feel acknowledged and validated and valued, where there are relationships, trusting relationships, where the more senior coach truly is invested in the success of the younger or the less senior individual. And sometimes where we meet some friction is, particularly in the United States, sometimes the positions as you move up in the organization are highly coveted. So there's a notion that if I help you, if I coach you, if I help you strengthen the skills you need to be a more effective employee, then you are a threat. Okay, that may be valid, but I also believe that, and the research bears out, that in organizations where coaching is of value and not just something that we say we do but we're not truly serious about, that the results speak for themselves. There's just the quality of the work is better, there's a higher level of collaboration, there's greater trust, people feel more valued, and the organization grows and hopefully prospers together. So I believe that coaches wear many hats. Coaches need to inspire their coachees to achieve things that they perhaps themselves didn't even think were possible. Coaches sometimes have to give constructive feedback. There's a way to give constructive feedback in a way that's respectful and that maintains the dignity of the other person. There's many colors and many dimensions to being a coach, but it is something that I advocate for and I champion with the people I work with.
So it generally works well hand in hand. Does it actually help if you actually have formal training along with coaching? Would that actually supplement it better rather than doing one or the other? Because that's a question that I generally get asked as well. You know, we've heard about coaching, we've heard about training. Which one should we choose?
I think it's a false choice. It would be like saying, which shoe should I put on in the morning, the left one or the right one? I think working together, if you can go to a rigorous training session, whether it's face-to-face, which is my preference, or online, which is where a lot of this stuff is moving, but have it also supplemented and augmented by a truly trusting coach that wants to see you be successful. For me, that's a combination that's really hard to beat. And what I tell people who ask is, to the extent that you can, and not everybody's a good coach, right? So what I would say to the client is, for this particular individual or set of individuals, try to identify those individuals in the organization who have the qualities that would make for a good coach. And whether it's a formal mentorship program or just an informal, coaching relationship, try to make that as important as sending people to a formal training program, because I think the results can be elevated when you use both in harmony like that.
There's also a lot of skeptics who turn around and say, look, people like us have made businesses out of doing leadership training. Leadership can't really be taught, especially in a classroom, and they're not going to get anything much out of it. They're actually far better off, learning for themselves and being in the deep end and so on and so forth.
Sure.
What would you say to the critics?
Well, I think that informal learning through informal channels in an organization are certainly a viable way to learn. You learn by doing at the organization or within the organization, and I certainly believe there's merit to that. But I also believe there's merit to getting an intact work team, or maybe not even an intact work team, maybe employees from disparate departments, you bring them together, you have a very interesting dynamic in the room of people who go, oh, you're Joe. I talk to you every day on the phone, but I've never met you before. There's all kinds of interesting possibilities that come out of just simply putting people in the same room who have never actually met each other, because maybe they're on different sides of the building. So for me, leadership training, and as I say, I'm a little wary of the word training, I think...
But learning facilitation.
Learning facilitation, yeah. I think that to the extent that you can utilize and leverage all of the available mechanisms, then you end up, I think, with a more effective leader. So I don't advocate for one approach over another. What I try to help clients do is create a holistic approach that takes advantage of many different media, many different avenues. Yeah, so some of it might be formal in classroom training, some might be coaching or mentoring, some might be informal learning on the job. We have something called, I did some work for a client where you would spend a half a day or a day with a coworker in another department, just learning what they did. You know, maybe the person in merchandising spent half a day with the person in finance, or the person in finance spent half a day with the person in sales. Now, they're never necessarily going to do that work, but simply understanding and becoming familiar with what's going on the other side of the building, for example, can't help but be, I think, useful, yeah, and helpful to getting an understanding of what's happening in the organization as a whole. I don't know if it's true here in Sri Lanka. It's certainly true here in the United States. Very myopic.
Absolutely.
Right? You have organizations that are divided into divisions, which are divided into departments, which are divided into teams, and then the ultimate indignity is when you stuff people in cubes, right? So you talk about segmentation, isolation, marginalization, when what's really needed, and the research is really clear on this, is when you get people together and sharing ideas and say, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if we did that. Hey, what it's a whole other type of energy, and that's what gets me excited. It's not right for every organization, but it is the gospel that I preach, if you will.
Yes, certainly. So towards the, I'm stuck for time, so I have to bring it to a close. But before I do, I really do want to go back to jazz.
Sure.
Jazz is all about collaboration. Jazz is all about a little bit of impromptu work. There's a lot of jamming sessions that takes place with artists. Now, since you draw a lot of inspiration from that, in this world of collaborative leadership and where people do want to work seamlessly and such, what kind of criteria, what kind of qualities should a new manager or a new leader have vis-a-vis the old archetypical command and control type?
Right. Well, one of the concepts that I'm a big proponent of is emotional intelligence. And anytime I have an opportunity to do an extended program over a series of weeks or months, I always build in a unit on emotional intelligence. To me, that is the foundation of effective leadership. Of course, coming out of the work of Daniel Goleman, who I'm sure you're familiar with, and some of the other pioneers, as a concept. And I'm less interested in emotional intelligence as a scientifically valid construct. That conversation doesn't interest me as much as emotional intelligence just as something that I believe in is truly something that all leaders need to possess to be effective. So it starts with self-awareness, which is an awareness of one's strengths and weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Self-management, which is how one conducts oneself under pressure, under stress. Empathy, social awareness, the extent to which we can understand or seek to understand the problem, the issue, the challenge through the eyes of the other. And then finally, relationship management, which is how do you form trusting relationships, communicative relationships, where conflict becomes healthy and creative as opposed to toxic and dysfunctional. So what I would suggest to any new manager is to become aware of emotional intelligence as a concept, and then to start doing a little self-work. It can be challenging sometimes for leaders, new and certainly veteran leaders, to turn the mirror on themselves and ask themselves, am I truly leading to in a way that is bringing value to the people that I lead, to others? And sometimes the answer can be not what you want to hear, but that's the truly great leaders have the courage to do that. And there's actually the courageous leadership, or the courage to lead. And I tell people I work with, it truly requires some courage. Not everybody
can take it.
Can do it. And you're not going to make everybody happy, sure. And you're probably going to make some people very upset. and that's okay. You learn to manage through that, you learn to navigate through that, and hopefully at the end you look back on a legacy where people feel that under your leadership they grew, they were effective, they were successful, they felt fulfilled, they felt appreciated and valued, they felt that their contribution mattered, and ultimately the company was successful. So just to get back to jazz, when you think about emotional intelligence, the ability of players to listen and adjust in the moment. I'll tell a very quick story that Herbie Hancock tells the story of once playing a wrong chord in the middle of a song when he was playing with Miles Davis, and he thought Miles was going to look at him and just, but instead Miles took the opportunity to play something on his trumpet that turned the mistake into something quite different and quite interesting, took the music in a new direction. That's emotional intelligence, to be able to hear that, take that opportunity that was presented to him in the moment and use it as a springboard to explore another musical direction. To me, that is such a powerful metaphor, and it's one that I think is relevant to any leader in any organization at any level.
I do have one final question for you, which is to share a story. Out of all the people you've trained, out of all the leaders you've met in person, what would be one of the stories that actually resonates most with you in this sphere of more collaborative, more open, more emotionally centric leadership? Share us one story.
Sure. Well, I actually do some nonprofit work in Philadelphia as well as for-profit, and I do some work for an organization that helps people who have been out of work for any number of reasons. Maybe they've been in drug or alcohol rehab, or who knows. Life has been difficult for these people, and now they're trying to get back into the work, back into work. And so I do programs for them to help them develop the skills and the competencies so that they can be effective once they return to the workforce. And last year, I was walking down the street, Philadelphia street, on my way to wherever, and one of my former students, a participant in this program, recognized me, and he called me, Dr. Brenner, it's James. And I said, James, how are you? And he gave me a big hug right there on the street. And he said, your program saved my life. Your program gave me the skills and the knowledge to go, and now I have employment. I have a job with XYZ organization. I'm back on my feet. I'm doing well. And we stood and talked for, 10, 15 minutes. And that was a reminder of why I do what I do. Sometimes we talk about organizations, it's too abstract. I try to bring it down. Every organization is made up of what? Individuals. And in that instance, in that moment, I knew that I had touched an individual. Now, he's not leading hundreds or thousands of people, and that's okay, because he found something in himself that I helped guide him to, some kind of insight, some kind of learning, that now his life is on a positive path. And whether it's for-profit or not for-profit, it doesn't matter. My goal whenever I work with a client, with an individual, is to leave them with a greater sense of what they're able to accomplish than they were before I had a chance to work with them. I show them the possibilities, or at least I hope to, that they themselves probably may not have even recognized. And there's nothing more fulfilling for me than that. And if I can bring in music, so much the better.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brenner.
My pleasure, Vidushi. It was a great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on your program. Appreciate it.
We'll see you soon.